Hey guys, all right, let's get into it, shall we? So, we're going to start talking about research and starting to talk about different approaches to research, and we're going to start there here with descriptive research. The chapter does this in a different way than I've seen before, but it works now that I kind of wrap my head around it. And so, we're going to begin by talking about these descriptive approaches to research. Now, one of the things I want to highlight early on is just talk about research generally, and then, well, let's just start here and go through. Okay, so when we use the word research, it's the systematic process of collecting and logically analyzing data for some purpose. I kind of made fun of people, not made fun of people. Well, yeah, okay. I kind of made fun of people who are saying things like, they went on the internet and they did their research about vaccines or something like that. So a lot of people suddenly fancy themselves as researchers. Well, to an extent, they are. Maybe I was unfair because, in this general sense, the idea of research is a very general word. Okay, and the systematic process of collecting and logically analyzing data, you could ask how systematic are the anti-vax researchers and how logical is their approach to it. You could maybe challenge some of those, but they are collecting information. That's what they're referring to. I went online, and at least from the sources I went to, I was open to the data they were presenting, and I took that and came to a view. So, point being that research is a very general word, and there's a lot of things we could refer to as research. Often when we use that word, though, we're implying the formal process of research, which will incorporate experimentation. So, let's get there a little slowly. But let's just, the second one, research methods have been developed for acquiring knowledge by reliable and valid procedures. And that's really what we're going to be talking about through this chapter a lot. Data collection may be done with measurement techniques, extensive interviews and observations, or a set of documents. So again, big picture is there's all sorts of ways of getting information, and really to some extent research is about acquiring information and looking at it and analyzing it. When we talk about, this says marketing research, don't worry about the marketing part. It's just the graphic. I like the graphic, so I grabbed it, but it applies just as well anywhere else. When we talk about research, yeah, sometimes the textbook does not go into the exploratory notion too much, but the idea is sometimes we begin by just doing a really rough collection of data before we get formal about it, just to get a little bit of information that will help us kind of figure out what it is we even want to learn a little bit more about. What's the problem we're trying to solve through our research? So sometimes we do a little bit of informal exploratory research on that regards, but when it comes to the more formal ones, then we go down this branch. And this says mostly quantitative in nature, but there's a lot of good qualitative research out there as well. So we'll talk about that distinction between quantitative, which means you're measuring something, you're getting numbers, math, you can do math on quantitative data, or qualitative, that tends to mean often it's text or recordings of voices or videos that you see. So it's something that is more, it can't be just boiled down to a number, or at least you have to analyze it to boil it down to a number. You have to somehow, see it because it's a very rich real world sort of behavior of some sort. So imagine, we're looking at essays of some sort and we're trying to put a number on them, a grade. Well, that's sort of a qualitative piece of work, right? You put a lot of work into it and the person has to read and look at that whole qualitative thing and analyze it in a certain way to get to a grade. Okay. So measure age, that's quantitative. But something more like what's somebody's opinion on something, that's qualitative. Hopefully that helps. We'll talk about that as we go through. But where we really are now, and this is the distinction down here that I really want to draw now. There's going to be what we call causal research. And when a lot of researchers use the word research, this is what they mean. This is the stuff that impresses us. This is where we think the real true knowledge is acquired. But we're going to start by talking about descriptive research. And so the textbook spends a little while going through some descriptive research techniques before it gets to the causal research. the textbook puts this in a really good way. Actually, I think I have it right here. Let's do this. So, descriptive methods are any means to capture, report, record, or otherwise describe a group. So this is the next sentence is the one I like. Descriptive research is usually interested in identifying what is without necessarily understanding why it is. Experiments get at why it is. And so the first stuff we're going to talk about will not be experiments. And as such, it will be limited in terms of what it will actually tell us. It will tell us what is. So a lot of this descriptive research, that word describe, right? It's just kind of going to give us some image of something. How is that for vague? So I mean, let's be a little more non-vague. Concrete. It says there are 4 popular methods to describe groups: naturalistic observation, participant observation, case studies, and surveys. We're going to, in this lecture, focus on the first 2. In the next lecture, I'll focus on the next 2. But let's talk about the survey, because hopefully you guys by now have done that Trust in Science survey at the beginning of this chapter. If you haven't, please do, just because I want to refer to it now and then as I'm about to. And so it'll make more sense to you if you've actually went through it. But that Trust in Science, when we give that to a bunch of people, let's say a bunch of students, intro psych students, let's say, what we're ending up getting is a bit of a snapshot of how much you guys trust science, right? So it describes you guys' opinions right now. It sort of paints a picture of it. So that's what these things are sort of about to some extent. Or, I mean, what it is, not why it is. So here's another way to think about it. I have that little diagram there that I'm going to bring up now and then. That's why it's in our title slide here. Excuse me for a sec. I have to clear my throat, and it's fine. Okay. This whole cycle, when we talk about the scientific method, this whole cycle is really what we think of as the scientific method. And that's why I was kind of set back with how the textbook was doing things at the beginning. But when they talk about descriptive research, it's really just this part, kind of. It's really, and this is where a lot of research begins, right? We want to begin by understanding what is the question that we're really interested in. What is the issue? We will eventually get to what we're going to call causal research, where we're forming hypotheses and doing experiments and analyzing the data, and that is what's going to give us more of a sense of why it is. But we're going to suspend that for now. We're going to focus just on naturalistic observation, participant observation, case studies, and surveys as a starting point to all this. Okay, so yes, it is research. It's part of the research enterprise, but it's not that experimental approach yet. We will get to that later in the text, in the chapter. Okay, all right. So with all that as a sort of caveat and a background, let me start you with a story of a sort. There used to be at Scarborough, right where the Tim Hortons was now, UT Scarborough. I hope some of you guys have actually been there by now, thanks to the pandemic. I know it's been crazy, but there was at one point, it's not there anymore, but there was a wall of mirrors by where the Tim Hortons was. Not right there, just a little more over where the women's washroom is. Now that I think about it, the wall opposite where the women's washroom is. Look at all this mental imagery I'm using to do this. Interesting. So at any rate, there was a whole wall of mirrors there, and there used to be some tables for students to sit there. And there was a rumor. The rumor was, on the other side of that mirror, there's a bunch of psychologists watching us while we eat food, while we talk to each other, and they're taking notes, and they're forming hypotheses while they watch us. There was no psychologist on the other side of that mirror. As you will learn as you go through that sort of research, doing that research that way would be considered unethical. You're not allowed to do research on somebody without them consenting, without them knowing that there's research happening, that they're involved in. Yeah, wow, did I say that sentence wrong? But you get the idea. But it was a rumor, and that sort of notion that we see here in police detective things, but also in some labs. You will see, for example, in developmental labs, there'll be rooms full of toys, and they'll put children in there, or maybe even mothers and children. And then on the other side of a one-way mirror will be a researcher watching the interactions and scoring them in various ways. So that sort of thing does happen. It generally falls under the label of observational research. So let's talk about observational research and pull apart what the textbook calls the two types. You're going to see there's sort of more than that, but kind of. And yeah, just make you feel really good about where this is. This is often where more formal research begins. It begins with observation. Now, the most well-known, I think, example of observational research, and one that's inspiring on many levels, is the research done by Jane Goodall on chimpanzees. And it's a fascinating story around this. There was a very famous archaeologist named Richard Leakey. This was a time we didn't know much about many of the animals in the world, and we knew nothing about chimpanzees. And Richard Leakey thought that was kind of interesting. He thought somebody ought to study them because they are the most human-like animal going. So he thought somebody should study them. Now, Jane Goodall was very young. She was not scientifically trained. But for whatever reason, she was connected to the Leakey family. She had her interest in science. And somehow, Richard Leakey got things set up so that she could travel to Africa to go live among the chimpanzees and to study them. Very vaguely determined, very vaguely defined. She had like I say, almost no training. Now, first of all, can you imagine if you're a mother, Jane Goodall's mother, having Jane come home as an 18-year-old woman and say, I'm going to go to Africa and camp out in the jungle with a bunch of animals we know nothing about? What do you think the mother was like? Ugh, like you almost can't imagine anything more scary for some mothers. So what did the mother do? She said, I'm going. If you're going, I'm going to be there with you. So her mom went with her at first. I don't think her mom was there the whole time. But yeah, eventually Jane is there in this place where a bunch of chimpanzees were. And she wanted to get to know them better. She wanted to understand them better. And so what did she do? Well, she first of all had to learn some basic truths of observational research, and we'll come back to this a little bit, but let's start it now. She had to become more chimp-like in her behavior, and also in how she smelled and how she looked. And so what she noticed is if she went around acting like a human being, they would just stay away from her, right? But she slowly learned that if she rolls in the same crap they roll in and behaves like they behave. So you see her here, she's sitting down, right? Down on her knees. Chimpanzees usually are low. They very seldom stand up on their back legs. They do, they're capable, but they don't do it very often. They're usually either down on their knuckles or just low, like you see this chimpanzee beside her who's low. By the way, that is a adult chimpanzee. We often think of these cute little chimps. Our notion of a chimp is usually an infant chimpanzee, a very young chimpanzee. They grow to be human-sized, roughly, but way stronger. I don't know if you look at that critter's arms and you look at Jane's arms beside him, you'll probably realize the chimp's arms are probably about 10 times as big around. Big muscles here, big muscles in the forearm. They're very strong and they're very dangerous. They can be very dangerous. If they attack you, you're in trouble if a chimp attacks you. Okay, so Jane got attacked, by the way, on numerous occasions. She got beaten, basically, by chimps. They will do that when they get angry. They'll beat on the weakest person. And what Jane kind of did is make herself the weakest member of the chimp group. Okay, so again, she tried to get the smell right. She tried to behave like they behaved. And, well, here's one of the things. So let's talk about observational research a little bit and how it kind of worked out for her. One of the things she noticed over time, and this is where the observation comes in, right? She's now hanging around the chimps. She's trying to act like the chimps so she can be around and she can watch them. She has a camera, she has a notebook, so she's doing that kind of stuff. But one of the things she notices at some point is that there's an interesting sort of greeting ritual among the chimps. Invariably, when two chimps meet, one chimp stares into the eyes of the other, and the other chimp looks down. And as Jane sort of watched this ritual, she realized that what a chimp does depends on its station in the social hierarchy. Okay, so let me step back there. So one of the first things she realized, even before this eye contact stuff I'm talking about, is that chimps form a social hierarchy. There is a top chimp who is in charge. And nobody messes with that chimp unless you want to be top chimp, and then it's a very nasty battle that ensues, and that very often, very seldom happens that a leader is challenged, and so everybody sort of has a place on the hierarchy, and Jane was kind of trying to be at the bottom because that's the least threatening to others to be, and she wanted to be non-threatening. She wanted just to be as fly on the wall as she could be. But she knew of this hierarchy, and she started to understand where different chimps fell on this hierarchy, who's sort of second in command, who's third in command, etc. And then what she noticed is this eye contact thing followed that hierarchy. It was always the more dominant chimp that stared in the eyes, and the more submissive or the less dominant, the lower on the social hierarchy chimp would put their eyes down. If they didn't put their eyes down, if they stared back, that was a challenge. That was kind of like saying, I'm not so sure I want to be below you on the hierarchy. And so that could lead to a battle, and it could lead to a changing in places of the hierarchy, depending on who wins. Okay, so this ritual became something that she sort of noted. And that's an example of observational research, how you can kind of say, oh, okay, I've noticed a way that they interact, a way that they maintain their hierarchy. It's not an experiment. It's just something she observes and thinks to be true. So it's not really, any proof. She might be interpreting things incorrectly, but that's what she thought was true, etc. Okay. Let's just read this a little bit, shall we, together, since I've got it all up there. So Goodall is best known for her study of chimpanzee social and family life. She began studying the Kasakela chimpanzee community in Gombe Stream National Park, Tanzania. Without collegiate training directing her research, Goodall observed things that strict scientific doctrines may have overlooked. They're actually kind of saying it was an advantage that she wasn't trained. I'll come back to that in a second. Instead of numbering the chimpanzees she observed, she gave them names, such as Fifi and David Greybeard, and observed them to have unique and individual personalities, an unconventional idea at the time. There was a notion that animals were just animals. They didn't have personality like we do. She found that it isn't only human beings who have personality, who are capable of irrational thought and emotions like joy and sorrow. She also observed behaviors such as hugs, kisses, pats on the back, and even tickling, what we consider human actions. Goodall insists that these gestures are evidence of the close, supportive, affectionate bonds that develop between family members and other individuals within a community, which can persist through a lifespan of more than 50 years. These findings suggest that similarities between humans and chimpanzees exist in more than genes alone, but can be seen in emotion, intelligence, and family and social relationships. So, really interesting example of observational research. One last story I'll give you about Jane Goodall, just to give you a sense of science, maybe. You're going to see there's going to be an issue of animal research that's going to come through it. It has to with me teaching this course, but we'll get there. We'll get there as we go through. But in this case, I always kind of like this story. When she wrote her first paper, she included things like the names of the chimpanzees in the paper. She didn't know how to write a scientific paper. She'd never written one before. She was just describing her findings the way she did things. She sent this to a journal where, of course, real scientists would review her work and decide if it should be published or not. And one of their first reactions was disgust, discussed over these names. They said, you are anthropomorphizing the chimpanzees. What does that mean, anthropomorphizing? That means you're acting like they're human beings. But they're not. Well, so that becomes the question. The researchers say you're making them, by giving them names and such, you're suggesting that they're more human than animal. But then, of course, the question is, well, how human is this animal? We don't really know how human the animal is. But the convention in science would have been to give each of these a number of some sort. Like you see on ducks when they have they stick a tag on them and everybody's got a tag number. That's the scientific thing, would have been to have a number of some sort and refer to them as numbers rather than to suggest that they were human-like. Now, this offended Jane because she'd been around them for a long time, and she said they are human-like. It's not inappropriate. It would be inappropriate to just give them numbers, and it would suggest something. So just a kind of interesting battle between that sort of scientific purity notion and then somebody who isn't scientifically trained just trying to tell the world what she's seeing. Okay, so cool. Let me just step back a little bit and just say, you read stuff like this and you read Jane Goodall's work, and it sounds really interesting and really fascinating and very suggestive, but it is just suggestive. Everything is her interpretation of the meaning of what she is seeing. So she saw stuff and she says, this is what it looked like to me. It looked like affection. It looked like whatever. But that's one of the limitations of observational research. Things just happen. You see them. You can try to say what you think is going on, but you'll never really know. The research won't ever tell you you're right. Okay. Point we'll come back to as we hit experiments and other things. Now, the textbook spends a bit of time talking about this distinction between what it calls naturalistic observation and participant observation. In this diagram, they call it participant and non-participant. So this would be naturalistic, according to the textbook, naturalistic observation. And really, the only difference is how present is the researcher. So here they're showing somebody watching with binoculars, which would be kind of crazy, but it's not crazy with the chimpanzees, right? With the chimpanzees, you could imagine that somebody might build a blind in a tree with some fancy optical equipment, and their notion is I'm going to try to be invisible. I don't want the chimps to even know I'm there. Why? Well, because once you start getting close, once you start doing what Jane did, things change. So let's hang off back here and let's start over here with naturalistic observation. The goal of true naturalistic observation is to just watch the behavior in its natural environment. Now, you can't actually do this to humans. Not really. Not as a formal researcher, because the humans don't know you're watching them. So this gets back to the UTSC question I told you about. You can't sneakily watch humans. You have to let them know that they're in a research study. You can do it, though, with chimpanzees or with animals of various sorts, and that's where a lot of naturalistic observation happens, trying to watch the animal in its native habit without it knowing you're there. That example you saw at the beginning of the chapter with the animals and the mirrors, that was naturalistic observation, right? They didn't really know a researcher was around, and the question was just how would they react to the mirror when they saw it. As far as the animal knew, it was just a mirror, but there was nobody watching. The animal didn't know anybody was watching. Okay, versus a situation where the researcher actually embeds themselves within some group. And so this has been done in cults. The textbook gives you that fascinating example of that study that's called On Being Sane in Insane Places, an example where a bunch of people tested how well mental health professionals could diagnose somebody. How do they actually know whether you're crazy or not? I'll let you read it in the textbook. It's pretty spooky. The punchline is a bunch of sane people were able to very easily get admitted into psychiatric kind of facilities. Once they were in those facilities, it was hard for them to get out because the professionals couldn't tell that they were really sane, even though they didn't do anything insane once they got in. They just behaved normally. The patients, interestingly, could tell the difference. The patients knew that that person's not really having an issue, but the professionals couldn't. So it was a very troublesome time, but that's one where the person went right in. So in order to understand what a psychiatric facility was like, these people went into them. And they observed them from within as a member of that community. So they pretended to have a psychiatric issue to get in there. They didn't once they were in there, but then they viewed it from inside. Okay, so that's what participant research is about. So let me just ask you for a second, since I've given you this, everything I just told you about Jane Goodall's research, what is it, non-participant or participant? Or I could say if it was textbook, naturalistic or participant. So it's a classic example of participant, right? So she wasn't hiding up in a blind in a tree or doing something like that. She tried to make herself one of the chimps. She tried to integrate herself. And she felt like if I can integrate myself, if they accept me, then I will be able to see what they do. And more than that, maybe I will become part. I will have an insider's perspective. I mentioned to you that Jane got beat on a number of times. She very quickly learned the sorts of things that would trigger a chimpanzee to be aggressive, because she was the low chimp on the totem pole. And when any chimp was angry, she was the one they would take it out on. And so sometimes it would just be a push, sometimes it would be a trip, sometimes it would be a hit, sometimes it would be an all-out beating. And, they never, not bad enough to kill her or do any serious damage, but enough to hurt her very, very badly at the time. And so, of course, as someone who's experiencing this directly because you're a participant, you're going to look for the signals and try to get good at predicting when this is going to happen and how to avoid it, right? So, yeah, participant research is a little different. And it really integrates you. And there are advantages of that, really seeing things from the inside as a member of that group. It's possible you could see things or experience things that you would never see if you were just watching at a distance. But there's also a downside. And let's talk about the downside quick. And it relates to something called the Hawthorne effect. So let me tell you about the Hawthorne effect, and then I'll just give you an example to have you kind of feel it. So the Hawthorne effect was originally discovered when people were doing some studies in an area called industrial organization. There were psychologists do all sorts of crazy things. One of the kinds of psychology is all about trying to create workspaces that are more, ultimately efficient and money generating, but often that means more human or more, somehow what can we do to make our workers work harder? And usually they only work harder when they're happier somehow. So lest that sound, totally nasty. But so for example, in this study, they were doing things like, well, what if we played a little bit of music in the background? Or what if we turned the lights a little lower? Or maybe we turned the lights a little brighter? So there were varying aspects of the context that people were working within. And so a bunch of researchers, literally imagine you're working in this plant and some researchers show up and they're doing stuff. And you notice, some days there's music, some days there's whatever. Some days it's just like it always was. What they found is that no matter what they did, productivity went up. Whether they turned the lights brighter or dimmer, added music, didn't add music, when they did something, any kind of research, when the researchers came in and did something, productivity went up. And after a while, though, they said, well, hang on. If anything makes the productivity go up, then it's not about the music. It's not about the lights. What is it about? Well, what it's about is the researcher, the presence of the researcher. When these people knew that their behavior was being measured and quantified, they worked harder. It changed the way they did things. The presence of the researcher changed their behavior. And we call that the Hawthorne effect. Here's the example I give to students that makes perfect sense. I tell them, usually I'm lecturing in the ARC, and it's 500-seater, me up front, and I say, imagine the following. Imagine at the beginning of class, this dude shows up, okay? And he just kind of, I don't know, beams in or walks in or however these guys get around. I don't know how they get around. But let's say he shows up and he's like, hey, I'm from another planet. We're just interested in humans and the Earth. So I just want to watch. Okay? So pretend I'm not here. I'm just going to go in the corner with my clipboard or whatever we aliens use to record things and just behave naturally. Do your thing. Okay? Cool. What's going to happen? Could I just ignore an alien and teach the way I always did? Could the students ignore the alien and just learn as they normally would? Or is the presence of that alien going to affect how we behave and how we act? And the answer to the second part is almost always yes. As soon as the researcher is part of the context, it changes the behavior within that context. And that's the worry with participant research. You have to be very careful. And that's what Jane was trying to do, right? Trying to become as chimp-like as she could so that they would accept her as one of them and would behave as naturally as possible. But you can never get that total naturalness of that sort. Okay. Cool. So that's mostly what we wanted to talk about for those first two, naturalistic observation, participant observation. I will just more generally say, when you zoom out a little bit more, there's different kinds of this sort of going on now that falls into this. So people watching people, one-way mirrors, sure. But again, I told you that doesn't happen very often in real formal research settings, although it does happen in developmental psychology, other areas like that. Mystery shoppers, I don't know. Okay. People watching an activity. So they say things like audits. Like if you're actually auditing, and we could talk about this formally. We could talk about like an audit of how I go through my grant money. Somebody could audit my grant spending. They're learning about my behavior that way, right? And this was behavior that I was engaged in over time, and there's a trace of that behavior. There's a record, and so they're auditing that record and learning about my activity and when I do things and why I, how I did things, not necessarily why, when. Mostly when. What I bought, when I bought it, that's what you kind of get the idea. There's also, by the way, nowadays, machines watching people. It's funny, this is almost old. Traffic counters, passive people meter. Yeah, so you do have things out there measuring how many people go by or whatnot. Nowadays, I would talk more about websites, and virtually every behavior you do on a website is being tracked and used to enhance that website, etc. So this isn't necessarily formal research, although it can be. We can, when you're developing a research product, you could say, I want to work on my interface design. So you could have people come in and formally and just give them tasks. Hey, come to my website and try to do the following thing. And I'm going to watch you. But watching you doesn't mean being in the same room, right? In fact, it doesn't even mean you could have people coming to your website from all over the world. Watching you means you're able to detect every click they make and what they go through. And so you can be watching in that way. So all of this to say, you can go from Jane Goodall, which is a very explicit, concrete version of observational research. But in the modern world, there's more automated technology ways of doing observational research, and it still kind of counts. If it's really just about trying to understand what's going on, where do people get lost on my website, what confuses them, then observational research can help you there. It doesn't tell you why, it tells you what. Okay, so let's leave it there. I'm going to do part 2 with case studies and surveys next, and we'll come back to that Trust in Science survey again. So again, if you haven't done it, please do so. Later. Bye-bye.